Welcome to another episode of Rebel Therapy Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Katie.
And I am your other host, Michelle.
And as you can all see, we have a special guest joining today. So, Michelle, why don't you introduce our special guest?
Yes, I will. This is Rachel Hanna. She is a registered dietitian in private practice. She specializes in sports nutrition. She's also a sports nutrition consultant at Maurten, who does sort of innovative fueling for endurance sports. She has been an elite runner for decades. She's a six-time Canadian championship winner, including the 2025 Canadian National Marathon Championship at the Toronto Waterfront Marathon this past fall. Her journey to this moment in life, I feel like it's been varied and challenging. I'm talking only running side of it, but like a lot of setbacks, a lot of successes. And so I think she's going to have a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with us. And lastly, and most importantly to me, she is my younger sister. So welcome, Rachel. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me both, and thanks for the introduction. And part of that race, Michelle was at the finish line and cheering me on, so I think that was part of the success, right? Having family and friend support there. So, yeah,
Oh,
happy to be here.
amazing. Well, we're really happy to have you. And I think that what we're going to do moving forward is kind of an experiment for us, which in true Gestalt style, is sort of par for the course. But I think what Michelle and I were envisioning when we decided to have some guests come, and thank you so much for being our inaugural guest, is to talk to people who are at the top of their game, who are sort of very successful in their field that is not therapy related, and really sort of have an interesting conversation, we think anyway, around how the skills that help them in their day-to-day life, in their professional lives, whatever, how some of those skills, strategies, we would even creative adaptations as therapists, how those kind of map on to sort of a therapeutic approach, right? Like look at the skills that we call them sort of transferable skills, let's say, and just hear from somebody else's perspective. And we'll sort of try to tie it in and see where it connects, where it maybe isn't connected, but really just have a conversation through that lens. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking maybe Rachel, you could even just start like briefly talking about your running journey, like how you kind of got to this point. Like you started running in what, grade 5? Like it never stopped.
Yeah, 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 that's a good way to put it. Never stop. That's a lot with like endurance training is that consistency, right? Like day in and day out. Like running such a hard sport that like if anyone out there who's gotten into running later in life or has tried it out, like it can take like 3 or 4 months before you actually start to feel like you're making momentum. So I think I've been lucky
Yeah.
from an early age that I've always enjoyed the movement and enjoyed the activity, and I've just been able to keep it up. But I think the reason I can stay consistent is because it's part of my work now, and it's just kind of part of my habits. Like you just get used to it. That's what I do in the morning. Like it's just like another routine. So, and I obviously really enjoy it. So that makes a huge difference with being able to do it long term.
Yeah, and like when I think about it, it's like you have all these different building blocks that you've kind of added as your life has gone on, like from your like experience in school and nutrition, and that kind of feeding into your running and like how to fuel for that, and like it all just kind of builds it together and feels like it's finally kind of like hit this really nice balance for you,
Mhm.
where one really feeds the other and helps with both. I feel like that fueling part of it has been one of the major things in the last little while that has really helped everything coalesce for you.
Yes, yeah, the fueling side, because if you think about like use the example of the marathon as such an extreme distance that like sure you can complete it without fueling, but you're gonna feel awful and you're gonna have to walk by the end, and it's not gonna be, you're gonna hit that infamous wall where you're running out of stored energy. And so a lot of what I'm teaching people is how to fuel properly so that they feel good, not only in their performance, but just health overall. And so early on when I first got into marathoning, so I did it first in 2015. That was my first marathon in Ottawa. And I didn't really know that much. I wasn't practicing like what I had, been learning in school, and I hadn't taken my sports nutrition diploma yet. So I did that afterwards, but I had to kind of learn the hard way of like not fueling properly, getting a lot of bone stress injuries, a lot of time off running too. And so putting that piece of the puzzle together and how it can relate even to the mental health side of it is that like carbs are our main fuel source for our brain, especially that's the main thing that starts to drop when we get tired. So it makes such a difference with training and racing too. And just over the years, there's been more innovations with sports fueling and our abilities to get higher, and me getting involved with Maurten. Like it's all kind of plays into the piece of the puzzle. I'm talking about it constantly. I'm thinking about it a lot. So I think that consistency has made a huge difference overall with me being able to still do it at this age
And enjoy it.
competitively and enjoy it. So
I love what you're saying. And there's so many, at least for me, as I'm listening to you talk, there's so many seeming obvious connections to sort of a mental health approach, right? Or an approach to consistent, healthy mental health, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And this idea, sometimes we use the analogy when Michelle and I are talking about a marathon, self support is necessary at every step, right? So, I mean, I think that when we're really busy or when we're living in a world like today where there's just an onslaught, a never ending deluge of difficult, challenging, scary, horrible information that we're trying to navigate, plus also
Mhm.
kind of live our lives. This idea that we sort of, I think a lot of us have learned to approach things with willpower, right? You just kind of muscle
Mhm.
through and make it work. And as long as it's a really short sprint, that might work, I suppose. But in terms of a marathon, it won't, like we will pass out or to your point, have to walk or whatever else. And so,
Yeah.
part of what Michelle and I are talking about is like when you're preparing for a marathon, if our life is that sort of mental health marathon, what are the small ways that we can consistently fuel ourselves, right, in terms of that self support to run this marathon, which at least at this moment, has no end in sight. That's the other thing, right? We don't even know how long we're running. So being able to sort of put that one foot in front of the other. And I love what you say about consistently, specifically. Consistency feels super important.
Yeah, I think a lot of it applies, and like some things that I've learned throughout the way is like to try to almost get yourself not kind of back to like neutral, because you can think very extreme in a marathon situation where it's like, how do I
Yep.
get back to that middle line of like, not thinking extreme, because you can be in a race and it's all about pacing yourself and learning, okay, how fast can I run for this period of time? So there is a lot of anxiety that comes with that. And then especially I'm in kind of a privileged situation where like I do get to, be leading in races and being in press conferences, favored to win some certain things. So it's great. It's exciting. It makes you run fast, but it also makes you kind of frightened when you're sometimes standing on the start line. So it's like, how can you channel that energy and make it excitement and not completely anxiety driven? Because I've seen that with other competitors too. They'll be able to start a race or to really derail their race, especially the marathon. They'll have to drop out just because of various reasons. But I think a lot of it comes back to getting maybe too anxious and not being able to calm yourself back down. And maybe I can use some examples of what worked for me in Toronto this year of what I found helpful. So I was actually doing some therapy sessions with a mental performance coach, and we went through a couple, we did a few together, and it was super helpful. And I was even just like scanning through some of my notes on like what we went through. So we met a couple times and we just talked about how to, like we said, get back to this neutral position. Because when you're running at extreme pace and for a long time, like you start to get tired. And so that's where your brain can start to get more negative. And I think that applies in life too. If you get
Yep.
overwhelmed by all the things you have to do, it's like you have to break it up into smaller parts to be able to get through it. So that's what the
Yep.
race. I try to break it up into fueling stations. So we get bottles or gels every 5K. So I try to break it up in terms of like, especially in Toronto being, it's a city that we get to run around. We're not going out and back. So that helps to be able
Yep.
to run through different areas. So I think breaking it up into chunks and taking it, a piece at a time, I think is really helpful. And then like, especially on the start line, like this year I found I was trying to get more excited about it because you can get overwhelmed with like a championship. But I think this was the calmest I was going into it because I just reminded myself, like, you've done all the preparation, you've done all the training. I tried not to almost run the race in my mind before the race because you can get
Yep.
into that where you go through it and you're like, oh, I think this is going to happen, or you're just imagining it too much. But then you waste energy
Yep.
stressing about something that hasn't happened yet. So I think in this
Oh my gosh.
situation, I was so busy with like I started with Maurten in September, and then October I was doing marathon talk the day before at the expo. And I remember my colleague saying, like, are you sure you should do that the day before your championship? And I'm like, yeah, I think it actually is going to help me because it was a bit distracting because I didn't have that much time to think about the race, and I'd already done all my prep. I was making sure, physically I was well rested and
Yep.
not running much. But I think that reset of like thinking about other things and not, just stressing about the race helped me. And then I think I just had a lot of like gratitude for starting with a position. I've been trying to work for them for many years and join their team because they are one of the top, sports fueling companies. So I was just very happy.
Yep.
And so I think that happiness, like standing on the start line, I was like, no matter what happens, run good, but like you will still go back to your normal life like next week. So I think like
You
putting
just
into
be okay.
perspective of like, yeah, you want to do well and compete well, but you have to like be like just really calm and relaxed. So I'd say like I was in a very good mental headspace, which is not always the case before every race.
Yeah.
Like some races I'll feel more negative, and it does impact how I run. So there is like a big correlation with just how positive you feel and when you're starting a race. I think especially like the long distance events.
Yeah, and having that like experience, right? Like from running so long, like, and you've run multiple marathons and you train long distances, right? So it's like you actually know the felt sense in your body of
Hmm.
running that long, and like when you're getting tired and like when you need to fuel, and like when maybe those like low points mentally are going to come, and that kind of thing. Even thinking about, you're talking about the starting line, and I feel like this happens all the time, or at least I see it when I'm watching you. Like people are excited or anxious and they go out way too fast, like even if they are more professional athletes or elite athletes,
Hmm.
then they have to either slow down dramatically or sometimes drop out, you know.
Yeah.
And I would say that's one thing about you, is like you're kind of like the Energizer Bunny, and that like you just keep going. Like even if you have to slow down, and I'm not saying it's easy at all, but like I just feel like you have this like, just gonna keep, yep, and we're going and we're running, and that's just how it
Yeah.
feels from the outside, but obviously it's different inside.
What I think I was hearing you say, Rachel, as you were describing kind of your approach to things, really overlaps with a lot of the stuff that we talk about from a mental health perspective. So I heard you say, it's important to be as fully resourced as possible before you start, whatever that looks like, right? It's important to stay in the present and really just focus on what is happening in this moment, not get caught in some kind of mental loop where you're out in a future that doesn't actually exist and it just wastes energy. We could call that worry or anxiety or whatever else. Then it's about pulling all the levers that you can. So the idea that you take control of the things that you do have control over, not the things that you don't. And then you top that off with some healthy distractions so that you're not, again, in either the past or the future. You kind of stay in the moment and not really think about these things. So your body is rested, but your brain is also rested, I think, if you're doing healthy distraction. And then this sort of gratitude mindset, and we talk about this a lot, like gratitude can coexist with all sorts of emotions. Gratitude doesn't necessarily equal happy, but gratitude is something you can choose. We can't really choose our emotional states, right? We are, how we feel, that just happens. But regardless if I'm feeling sad or lonely or angry or frustrated or whatever, I can still at the same time choose gratitude. And so all of those come together to let you be the Energizer Bunny, I guess, without having to collapse, right? This amazing resiliency, I think, and ability to keep going in a healthy, sustained way is kind of what I heard you say. Does that kind of resonate?
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great way to summarize it. And like you said, it's good through these analogies of the marathon to other strategies in life when you feel anxious about something or it just feels
Yeah.
overwhelming, because I think a lot of it applies. Yeah, that ability, I think, to keep going, like for me, because a lot of it, we're running based on time, we're competing against each other. But to me, I try to draw other inspiration too in the race. Like I did one in December, which was a few months after Toronto, because I ran, good time on the day. I obviously was very happy with it, but I was trying to run a personal best. So again, I was trying to, run my fastest time ever. I was in the best shape, I thought. So like, oh, I'll sign up for another race. So kind of to Michelle's point, just kind of keep going. But then eventually your body sends you messages where like you're not ready. So I did that race. I started, but it was a very different situation. Like I didn't feel that same excitement. I think I was just generally a little bit more tired, just felt a bit off. So even though I was happy to be there and warming up, I'm like, yeah, today's the day you're gonna run a PB. So I was in a good mindset. But then as soon as I started to run, my body wasn't responding to that. So in the racing scenario, like, yeah, I could have dropped out. A lot of my competitors did, but I decided to finish because I'm like, maybe I'll motivate someone else to finish who's behind me, or it doesn't look great on the race if half the field drops out. So I was like, I'll finish. I'm going to run a lot slower than I want to. So I think sometimes trying to go beyond, like, you have sort of an A goal, but then you want to try to think, what are some other goals too, and things that you can get out of this besides just that number
Well,
one thing that you came here to do, which for that race, it was to run
Yeah.
the best time, but I didn't do that. And I was very far off, but I
Well, I was
finished.
gonna
no,
say, like, there's kind of almost like a humbleness in that, in the sense of like you have this sense of how you want to do, how you've been able to do in the past, and then you're actually dealing with what's happening in that moment. Like your body is not feeling it. Maybe it's hot, whatever. It's like all these different components. And
Mhm.
instead of being like, I can't run the way I want, so I'm just like not gonna do it. Like I don't even want to. You know what I mean? To just be like, okay, I have to adjust to how I am right now, and then run the race that I'm actually in, not the race I wanted
Yeah.
to be in my mind, but the race that's happening
Yeah.
right in front of me.
Yeah.
so it sounds like clients that we talk to who come into situations, whether it's a relationship or it's a situation in their life, and they come in with sort of a template, right? Which on paper looks great. They've done a lot of work, they've put a lot of thought into it, they've considered all the factors, and they show up in real time going, okay, this is how it's supposed to be. And it doesn't match what the reality of their actual body or life or circumstance actually is in that moment. So what I'm hearing you say is that you showed up with this great idea and it should have worked, right? But for whatever reason, your body was having a different experience and you were able to adjust your expectations to
Mhm.
still achieve something that had meaning for you. Yeah?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I still finished. I was happy with that. And like I tried to look at all the positives with it. Like I think just with
Yeah.
age, like past me would have just been like, oh, this is terrible. Like maybe I should give up running. Like you just can't, you get into that catastrophic thinking where it's like, oh, this isn't working. I think to me, like I can see beyond it and like the more, social aspect. I got to go on a trip, see my friends. Like I just try to bring all the other positives into it. Which I think
Hmm.
helps. But like you mentioned, like it's like not meeting, like you have an expectation of how something was going, but you have to be flexible, like anything that's not always
Absolutely.
gonna go that way, especially when you're trying to do something like run your fastest time ever. It's like everything has to come together like on the day to be able to do that, like from a performance standpoint in athletics. So it's like you can prepare all you want, but you have to be able to do it on the day of. So I often talk
Yeah.
about this with my husband Joe. Like he coaches me, and we often because I'm always like, okay, I just want to run my fastest time in one event when I've been healthier, like in the last like 5 or 6 years. But he always reminds me, he's like, it has to be the day. You have to be able to push yourself. It has to be good weather. Like all the things kind of have to come together. So
Yeah,
it's
like the stars have to align. So this is the whole
yeah,
like you pull all the levers that you can, but yeah, you can't control the universe, right? So you got to kind
yeah.
of adjust to how things go. But the other thing that I'm hearing you say, and maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it feels to me like you're saying you're able to do all of that without self-judgment, which is, I think,
Yeah.
super important, right? Like looking around
Yeah.
going, wow, okay, I thought I was going to be able to do XYZ today. Turns out I can't. So I'm going to adjust those expectations, find the meaning and value that I can find in this experience either way, and do that
Mhm.
without judgment. I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that's like super important because you want to be as kind to yourself as possible. And now that I'm reflecting on the race, like it's like whatever way you can get into that positive mindset. We always talk about like watching something funny the day before, or just like keeping really light. Like I think is so
Yeah.
important when you're about to compete because your brain starts to get negative because you know what you're about to put your body through and you know it's going to hurt. So there's always
Really.
like moments like I'll have every moment before a race where I'm just like it's almost like a dread feeling that'll come over me and then I'm like, wait a second, okay, how do we counter that and get back to like the present moment and then look at the positives. Like I think our brains are just very wired to like think more negatively. So it can definitely
Oh,
happen with like extreme athletic events too.
Maybe even reminding yourself like that you're actually choosing it, right? Like I
Yeah.
think, like you said, when there are things that are meaningful that we want to do, and then when it kind of like comes to it, you're like, why did I agree to do this again? But then when you actually are doing it or after you do it, you're like, oh yeah, like that's why. But
Yeah.
the other thing that I was thinking, like when you were saying kind of like positive mindset, I feel like that gets thrown around in like the therapy world, or especially on like social media. And I think people sometimes are like, oh, positive mindset, like that, what does that even mean? Like it's bullshit, or it's like, kind of lip service, or like I can't force myself to be positive. But like I know for you, and for when we tell clients, it's like it actually has to be something you believe. So even if it's like you're saying I just need to get back to neutral in that moment,
Hmm.
it has to be something that actually resonates with you, like not what someone else is telling you should be your positive thought, like what is
mm,
actually real for you. I'm
I
curious.
think because like we almost call it like tricking your brain. Like when I'm reading like a thing that I wrote, a note that I did in my sessions leading up to the race, and it was like having to tell your brain why you're good all the time, like constantly throughout the
mm.
race. You're like reminding yourself like everybody's feeling, the fatigue of racing, and so you're almost like reminding yourself that you can do it like the whole time. And I think that's where phrases and just things like that can be really powerful when you start to get tired. So that is
Well,
something. Yeah.
it actually sounds like good parenting, to be honest, right? Like kids
Yeah.
need to be seriously, kids need to be
Yeah.
told, little kids especially need to be told all the time that they can do it, that they're great.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
seems so self-evident as adults. You're looking, you're like, well, obviously that's so clear. And yet
Yeah.
kids still need to hear it over and over again. So it's like beautiful, like self-coaching or self-parenting in that moment in this lovely, supportive, motivational way, as opposed to the mean coach that I think left to our own devices, we often sort of create for ourselves, right? Which is,
Yeah.
I think, meant to motivate us as well, but the way you're doing it clearly, I would argue, works much better.
Yeah, no, it's a good way to put it. Yeah, you're like coaching yourself through it and you're just like reminding yourself because I think you're very vulnerable at that state when like your blood sugars
Yes.
are starting to drop, you're extremely tired, like the whole time you know how much you have left to go. Like you can't turn that part off like as much as
No.
you'd like to. And I actually was talking about this as like I wanted to, like when I was reflecting on my races and I was like, I start, I use all these strategies, I'm great. And then, I get to 30, 32K. And that's where like I literally just start to count down. And then with the lady that I've been working with, Beth, like she was
Yeah.
like, well, why is that bad? Like I thought it was such a negative thing that I'm like, oh, I'm counting
Mm.
down, okay, I've got this
No.
many minutes left. But it's like my coping mechanism, which I think again can apply if someone gets anxious or they feel overwhelmed, like, naming things or counting down, like that strategy I use in running all the time.
Yeah. Or I mean, this,
Totally. And
I was
like
gonna
that
say,
you
go
need
ahead.
different coping mechanisms at different moments.
That's right.
Hmm.
Right? Like, so what's appropriate at 32 kilometers is not appropriate at 10 kilometers. And I think sometimes
Yes.
like people forget that in like any difficulties that they're going through in life. They're like, this strategy worked before, it's not working now, right? So that flexibility, and like Katie always say, like we talk about having all these different tools in your toolbox, right? And
Hmm.
sometimes you don't need a hammer, right? You're like, but the hammer
Yeah.
worked. And it's like, well, it's not a nail anymore. So
Yeah.
what's like the next tool? But like, how do you develop all those tools? And I feel like you've done that and you've worked really hard to develop that and continue to develop that, which I think is quite impressive.
Yeah, yeah, I think having the different tools and then like in training, like when you train so much, like that's why we can compete well, is that I do so many workouts where I feel uncomfortable, I'm tired by the end. Like
Yeah.
nothing's like racing, that's like ultimately the hardest, but you're uncomfortable for long periods of time, so you almost get used to that and you're like, how do I cope with this? Especially when you're by yourself training. So I think it's
Yeah.
really helpful and just again feeling almost like bored because I live out in the country and sometimes I'll run and not listen to music. And it's like, how do you spend so much time like being bored? Which I think is a skill that like sometimes we don't get access to, right? Because we're so overwhelmed with our phones, social media, we're constantly stimulated. But I think I do that for a reason that I'm like, okay, it has to force yourself to just be uncomfortable being alone in your own thoughts.
Well, I would also argue that that boredom that you talk about, which is really important. I work a lot with teenagers and we talk about this quite a bit, right? Like, oh my God, I can't be bored. It's like, yes, but
Mhm.
when you think about the creative process, and in this type of therapy, we talk about the fertile void, right? So the idea that there's nothing and from nothing, all things are possible. And so
Mhm.
until you can get to that place where you can start really tapping into that creativity or that restoration or whatever it is you want to call it, you have to, I think, to your point, develop a tolerance for boredom, which is often very
Mhm.
uncomfortable, especially, again, to your point, in this world where we, if we choose, are never bored. I mean, there's always something to stimulate us if that's our choice.
Mhm.
Instead, I think we have to go the opposite way and seek out opportunities for boredom to let
Mhm.
that other growth happen. Yeah. I'm just envisioning you running for hours with nothing. As the children say,
Yeah.
raw dogging, right? Life.
I
No
do that. Like
music,
it's no
nothing.
joke. Last weekend I ran, it was a two
Amazing.
hour run. I had no music, like out in the country, and like it was nice out, so that helped. But there's been
It's
situations on the
impressive.
treadmill here where like
Yeah.
my headphones will die, or like I don't like the music choice, so I just get frustrated, and then I'll just
Yeah.
run, and I'm literally on a treadmill, and I'm like not doing anything but like counting down the time, and I'm like, this is so boring, but it's really good mental training. So I do purposely do that, but it doesn't feel easy. Like even some days I'm like going out, I'm like, what am I gonna think about for the next bit? But you'd be surprised. You often come up with things like, oh, work wise, or just like thoughts come to
Yep.
you if you allow yourself to actually have that space. So I think it's
That
actually very
freedom and
helpful.
space. Yep.
Yeah, and
No,
I
I
was
love that.
thinking too the element of just actual social support, right? So obviously your husband and your coach, and so he's giving you workout. So you're trying to finish the workout, like you're part of this greater plan. You're going to check in with him. You're alone in that moment, but you're kind of held by these connections. And even like, the running community is so like large and friendly, and like you're so kind of involved in so many people. So even like you said, like that social component of going to the races and people know you and it feels nice. And like, so that's kind of reinforcing in itself. And I think that's also important for people to remember. Like they sometimes think like, no, like I just got to always do it on my own. Or like if I need somebody else to like help me or give me a plan or like lean on them for whatever, that somehow it's like a failing or somehow a detriment, and just like reminding people that that actually is part of a successful component of living well.
Having that community structure, and I was doing some research on the blue zones and the diets and when people live the
Yeah.
longest, and a lot of that is that community connection. So I always draw that back to running, and that's why I think I've been in the sport for so long, is that it becomes beyond just the race results. Like I always think when I retire, like sure, I'll look at my times, but that's not what I'm going to remember being like, oh, I ran,
No.
2:20, 2:32 in the marathon. Like that's not what's going to be the highlight. It's going to be those moments and all like the connections that you get. And I think like you said with training and like we are connected, your coach checks in, we use Strava app, like people can see what you're doing as much as you want to share. So I think to that point, like you have that accountability of that running community too, which really helps.
It connects a little bit to something that we've talked about before, and like as our roles as therapists, right? Like I'll say to clients, you know what, you did not ask for that wound or whatever it is that you're trying to heal, right? That was given to
Hmm.
you. Nobody can help you with that really, but what I can do is support you while you heal yourself, right? And so it
Hmm.
feels a little bit like nobody can help you run. You've got to do the running on your
Hmm.
own, but the
Yeah.
supportive environment around you creates an environment that supports your ability to do this work, right? I think
Yeah.
it's kind of similar. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think even a good example of that too is like I've had to obviously do a lot of treadmill stuff the last few winters because it's just been so cold and like sure I
Yeah.
don't love running on the treadmill, but it like if I use it at home versus I go to the gym and I talk to people or I get like conversations, like I always have a better workout if I'm around other people or I'm like checking in somehow. So I think that's a
Yeah.
good example too. Again,
Social.
but yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us. It's been such a pleasure having you. And how can people find you? How can people follow what you're doing or, check in on your progress?
Yeah, I use Instagram, so it's just Rachel Hannah RD, so they can follow me on there. I post a lot about running or Maurten related content. That's pretty much it right now. And then I have a website, so it's just rachelhannahRD.com, and then my email's the same as that. So yeah, I do one-on-one, like mostly sports nutrition counseling, but also just general health eating, weight management, stuff like that.
And
All
is
right.
there anything we didn't talk about that you feel like, is important to share, or like anything you've kind of
Mm.
thought about in terms of mental health stuff, or just any little tidbit?
Yeah, I think we touched on a lot, like, gratitude, how do you use that? Feeling like using that, channeling that excitement rather than anxiety, because they're both going to be there. So I think it's just like, which one are you more like leaning into, like on the day? And then just like, yeah, realizing like, I think the consistency part of it's the biggest, like with anything when you're trying to get better, it's just like, how can you do that every day and build systems where you work out, you have habits driven around it. Like I intentionally plan things so I have to be back by a certain time. Like I make sure like those things are in place so that I can be as consistent as possible. And then I think for anyone who's getting maybe new into exercise, just like finding something you really truly enjoy, like some part of it, you have to. Otherwise, like it's so hard to maintain that. So I think that joy part of it is big.
So we'll end on joy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye.